Many years ago, James Baldwin wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Tonight, we're bearing witness to the lynchings in Duluth. My name is Michael Fedo. I'm the author of the book, The Lynchings in Duluth, and I will be sharing this evening with my good friend, Dr. Bill Green from Augsburg University, also a noted and prize-winning author himself. And we wish to welcome all of you who are tuning in this evening to this event as we move forward to discuss with you the lynchings in Duluth. Almost exactly 100 years before the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, 3 other black men were brutally lynched by a white mob approaching 10,000 people. These murders took place 155 miles north of Minneapolis in Duluth, my hometown. In 1973, I was beginning a novel set in northern Minnesota and remembered my mother telling me about the lynchings. I decided to use a mob scene in one of the chapters of my novel, and over a number of weeks, I searched for the book I was sure had been written along with other official documentation of the large mob associated with these lynchings. There was no book. Librarians knew nothing about the lynchings. Information about and even acknowledgement of these murders seemed non-existent. I would discover that the lynchings and the shameful trials that followed had been unremembered and hidden for 60 years. So I ditched the novel and began what would become an ongoing and life-changing journey. Martin Luther King said, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." The first edition of The Lynchings in Duluth was published 41 years ago, and amazingly, most white Minnesotans still know nothing of the tragedy. On June 14, 1920, 13 blacks from the John Robinson Circus were arrested for a rape that never happened. The next night, 3 of those black men, Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee, were ripped from their cells, beaten, and dragged 1 block away from the jail to be hanged from a lamppost. A graphic postcard commemorates these tragic murders. Now, after that, I was asked to talk about how this was received in the community and in the state. Well, it took me about 2 years to finish researching the book, perhaps another 1.5 years to write it, and then I began the submission process. Over the course of about 2.5 years, I submitted this manuscript to between 30 and 40 publishers. All of them rejected it, of course. But even for those times, by the way, these were nearly all standard rejection slips. They were not personal at all. They'd say things like, "Thank you for sending us your book, but it doesn't meet our needs at this time." And but 3 came with some written notation. And the 3 that had this notation were, I thought, even terribly politically incorrect for those times, which would have been about the mid-1970s. One of them said, "We feel we couldn't profitably publish this because black people don't read books." Another comment was, "We don't want to be responsible for the riots that would follow publication of this book." And still another said, "Civil rights books about civil rights," I think is exact wording, "are passé now." This came to me 6 months before Alex Haley's book Roots became a runaway international bestseller. So there was this, finally, a small company in Orange County, California, agreed to publish the book. And when it came out, I wasn't sure what to expect, but I guess I was not prepared for what did follow. The reviewer for the Minneapolis Tribune, among other things, said, "This event occurred 60 years ago, and now along comes Michael Fedo to rub our noses in this unseemly event all over again." So there were other favorable reviews, of course, but the newspaper of record in Minnesota said that I was rubbing the state's nose in this horrific event all over again. That, in fact, it was better left forgotten, as it had been for 60 previous years. I did receive some, I suppose, hate mail from a number of sources. Not that many, not as many as some of my friends thought that I would get. I was encouraged to get an unlisted phone number, which I did not do. I was going to wait and see what happened. I didn't get any crank calls, but I did get crank mail, including one from Elroy Stock, who was a wealthy man locally and spent many decades sending racist mails anonymously to people who were working for racial equality, people who were involved in mixed marriages, people who adopted biracial children. And this went on for decades until he donated $500,000 to Augsburg with the understanding that a building would be named in his honor. Augsburg learned of the anonymous mailings of Mr. Stock and refused to put up a building in his honor, but difficult tax issues were too difficult for them to return the money, but they did a wonderful thing with it. They used that $500,000 to fund minority student scholarships. And that is essentially the story of the first edition of the book. The publisher, the initial publisher, went bankrupt, and the book disappeared within 6 months. But 21 years later, the Historical Society Press contacted me about reissuing the book, which pleased me, but it also surprised me because the History Center did not favor my initial inquiries into this lynching. It was a very chauvinistic organization back in the 70s, and they also would have been happier if I hadn't pursued this research. But they've been a wonderful publisher. They've kept it active and in print for the last 21 years, and I'm very grateful for that. And that's the experience of the history of the book. And I think my good friend Dr. Green has some background on what led to these lynchings.
Can I ask you a question? I should have checked you first before now, but I'll just put it out there. In 1992, 93, I think it was, I was just starting at Austin. And I heard about Days May. That was a time that had begun at the time during Vietnam. There was a college who would spend a whole day to just talk about issues of significance. And that celebration had gone dormant for maybe 10 years or so. And I had the idea of wanting to bring your book, because I heard about it through word of mouth. I had a hard time finding it. I think it was before the Historical Society reissued it. And we hadn't met yet. And so I asked you if you'd be willing to come. Do you remember coming to Augsburg?
Yes.
I was the one who was trying to set things up, organize, get the room, get the water, put out the notices, and I was extremely inept at doing all that because I'm a history prof, right? We're not trained to do anything practical. And I didn't really expect, we got a modest-sized room overlooking the park. which was a great place to be when you want to see students celebrate summer. Right? And so we were sitting up there, and I didn't really expect much of a turnout, but I didn't really care because this was going to be an interesting discussion. Well, it turns out people started coming in, started filing, not just faculty members, because grumpy because they have to grade papers, but they were genuinely interested in this. But it wasn't just faculty members who began to attend. Students began to file in. And they weren't doing that for a grade because grades had already been submitted. Also, we had people from the community coming in who had heard about your book and about the topic. The next thing I saw was that this room that I didn't think was going to be filled was absolutely filled, standing room. I don't know if you recall that.
I do.
And what was planned for? We were only planning to talk for about an hour and a half. It went for much of the afternoon because people did not want to leave. This was before we began to see people really come back to the story, but they were already there. There was something being manifest in the fact that there's enthusiasm to understand this event that they didn't know existed. I'm bringing that up in part to ask you if you recall that time. You said you did.
Yes, I do.
But I'm wondering, what do you recall being the reason why people turned out like they did in the 90s, in the 1990s, before your second book came out? What was the reason to come out?
I've thought about that over time, and I think there was a curiosity and a disbelief, and that probably these kids were saying, "What? We had a lynching here? I thought that was Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi." And so I think that kind of took them back. They were stunned. And they were probably also surprised that they had never heard of it. So there was that sense of curiosity. How could this have happened here? How come I never knew about this? Why didn't I learn about this in class? There was all of that, I think, working in the favor of getting a relatively large gathering for that.
I would submit one additional thing. As you may recall, during this time, the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, we had seen a series of police misconduct cases occur in Minneapolis. This was the time when the city began to initiate a civilian review authority to provide citizens with a way of expressing their complaints against the abuse, of police abuse. And I've often wondered if, even though the two instances weren't directly connected, whether people were trying to find the language to explain what it is that they had seen. And, I think this is why people have long been curious in this story. And are interested in racial history, because people are so inarticulate in expressing themselves in matters of race that they're looking for a way to connect, looking for a way to tap into feelings that had not been articulated in the past. And I suspect that to a very large extent, your presentation, your book that day in May in the 90s, was one of the first major opportunities for people to find the language to describe something they've always known was there, but was not able to really put into words. That's just a thought. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think I would agree with that. I never pass up an opportunity to articulate, what happened then and why this book, this story is important. And it's important to understand history, and it's important to understand ourselves. Even among many people who say things like, "There's not a racist bone in my body," don't understand how they, in fact, are racist themselves. And I think a lot of this has to do, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, Bill, but that there are a great many citizens in Minnesota and all over this country who are unwilling or incapable of empathy. And because of that, whatever, when they there are people who, it's on the web, I've seen things who would say that George Floyd was, deserved it almost. He had this coming. He was, he wasn't a quality human being. And I have a hard time getting my brain around that in some ways, but in other regards, I don't. I think that these are people who simply will refuse to empathize with anybody who struggles for whatever reason.
Well, I think that's true, but I think that there's an additional issue that people are grappling with now, and I got some of this from talking with young people, some of whom were reporters who called and wrote in, and I would ask them questions. Well, what do you think about what this means, how this comes down? And I was surprised at how reporters and young people in general, and not just limited to young people, how people in general were feeling, because the experiences of the lynchings and racial tensions today are seemingly coming out of the blue. That this recognition, this awareness is coming out of the blue. That they're having a hard time putting into words what they feel, and they feel a little awkward and even trying. So it's for some of them quite frustrating to be able to engage, in part because they feel that their inability to engage is somehow casting themselves in a real negative light, not only in the view of the person who's listening to them, but in their own view, because they feel they should know better. I think the whole discussion of race is a very, very complicated thing when you feel especially that your own words can be used against you. And that's the easiest way the surest way to discourage people from even engaging. But they're constantly trying to figure out how to engage. I think that's what is at play here, and what was at play back in the 90s. They're still trying to figure out how to deal with this situation, how to deal with our neighbors who are of different races, how to live in a world and experience life without fearing saying the wrong thing. How do we empower ourselves to look at ourselves as a society boldly and boldly? Anyway.
There's a point that I haven't brought up for a while, but and this is just a personal observation of my own, that when I look back to the early 1970s, when I was talking to people in the Black community in Duluth, almost to a person, they were saying things like, "We never had any race problems until after the lynchings, and then everything came down." And my thoughts on that were that most people in Duluth didn't know that the young woman had not been raped. They didn't know that. I think they got it. They sort of intuited that after hearing everything that went on. But the white people in northern Minnesota, the reaction when poor Max Mason was sentenced was kind of a sigh of relief. This proved that, it was wrong to have lynched these fellows, but they did this to her, and the conviction of Max Mason solidified that. But I think what happened then is that a lot of northern Minnesotans who probably saw very few Black folks and likely never had any kind of interaction with any, there were so few living in northern Minnesota, they bought into the southern notion of racism, passed that on to their children and their grandchildren who are now who we are our age. And I've often thought, if I could talk to somebody who's maybe 50, 60, 70 years old, who has a racist attitude, And if they were honest and said, where did this come from? I bet they would tell me, or anybody, if they were going to be honest, that, well, Dad thought that. Dad, always didn't trust black folks. And Grandpa didn't either. And without any kind of evidence whatsoever, they just bought into that, and it became systemic. And I am hopeful, because of the attention that these things are getting today, that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren are not going to have those attitudes.
You say you're hopeful.
Yes.
Do you feel that we have progressed?
Well, in a legal sense, yes, we had legislations enacted during the administration of Lyndon Johnson for housing and education and job equity, but that didn't change people's attitudes necessarily. That made them adhere. This is the law. We'll have to go along with this. But I don't think that the attitudes change. But I think after that, personally, I encountered fewer racist comments. But more recently, I think the people who hold those attitudes and who've always held them feel they have license now to express those. And I think we're dealing with that right now, as evidenced by the killing of Floyd and Arbery in Georgia and many of these other cases.
I grapple with the issue of hope and whether there's progress. People always have been asking me, frequently have been asking me, if I feel that there's progress. And as a historian, I'm trained to basically say it remains to be seen whether we've progressed. Because we look at the past, we look at the context, we look at the long game, so to speak, before we make any assessments. And that there are always going to be rises and falls, pitches and whatever in the course of time. So it's the long run that tells us whether we've made any progress. On the other hand, and I guess I'm going to be telling you this, don't tell anybody else I said this, but I'm beginning to feel a little hope, probably more than a little hope, because of not just the volume of protest, which is inspiring, and the number of people who are engaged, which is inspiring, but the small things that I think I otherwise would ignore. People seem to accept the fact that we live in a diverse society. And proof of that is in the advertisements on television.
Yes.
Advertisers wouldn't use multi-race families and same-sex families to promote products if they knew that it was going to turn off consumers. It's a strange way to measure progress, I think.
Right.
But I think that's really kind of looking at where America is. And I also remember seeing the today's on television today, where in a march, I think it was in New York, it may have been New Jersey, I forget which state. Black Lives Matter made a presentation. They marched through a neighborhood, and there was a white guy with his friends demonstrating his contempt for Black Lives Matter. And he showed his contempt by kneeling on the neck of a friend of his and screaming to the marchers as they passed by that Black lives do not matter. This was in the national press today. That kind of contempt is almost expected, but the reaction of the people in the march, the reaction of the commentators, they were people of all races who were just as upset with that display. And all of this kind of conveys to me that we seem to be in a very interesting time in history, where people are yearning for progress, are yearning for a time where they can just kind of stop being angry and tense around each other, where they can just make peace and sort of create a new community, a community. But,
Yeah.
maybe we're on different sides on this particular matter.
Well, I don't know. We're closer together than I think a lot of folks are, and you and I have had many discussions over the years, and I've always respected your work. I've liked your books, and we'll get.
Continue.
One thing I guess I should announce, it may have been announced earlier, is that those of you who are watching, if you have questions for us, you can post those, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. When we have more or less concluded this discussion between us, I guess I still do have a smidgen of hope that these things are going to work out much better than they are today. I think the killing of Mr. Floyd, I believe was a benchmark, and I just can't conceive of things like that moving forward in that negative way. What it's going to take to reform police, I'm not sure how that's going to play out. I think that the governor right away was as upfront as he could be by saying chokeholds were immediately banned, that officers have a duty to report and intervene if another officer utilizes unauthorized use of force, regardless of whether that offending officer is your superior officer. That you're not to be intimidated by the fact that that person is behaving badly, behaving very inappropriately. That you're to turn that person in. And so I think the body cameras now can be audited by the Minneapolis Civil Rights Department. I think that's going to have an impact as well. And again, I guess I would like to think that attitudes will change. And in some cases they will not change, but people who hold these attitudes will not feel free to express them and act out, which is even more important. It won't be able to take the acting out that is in fact taking place today, where people, for whatever reason, especially I think police departments, think it's not going to matter, that we are going to be sustained by our department, by the investigation, and even by the courts, which has been what's happened in the past. We have a question here that has just come up, which is, have you studied present racial attitudes in Duluth? I haven't read your book yet, but wonder if the activities of the many Minnesota chapters of the KKK influenced the people of Duluth. They may have. There was no KKK in Duluth at the time of the lynchings, but there was a KKK after the lynchings. And probably a lot of attitudes that people are holding today were passed down from the grandparents and great-grandparents who were members of the KKK back in that era.
I'm not an authority on the KKK, but I have read that that organization was fairly dormant for a while, but it sprang to life, as you said, immediately after the lynchings. It wasn't because of the lynchings, but the KKK is in effect revived in the early 1920s. And it's a home base. It's not in the South, it's in Indiana. Interestingly enough, where it had the largest chapter of the Ku Klux Klan throughout the nation. And that the movement itself spread to the point where they actually could affect federal policy. There's a famous picture, illustration that you can pull up, depicting the KKK marching on what is it, Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, in an effort to sort of leverage their ability to persuade legislators in Congress to support laws against immigration and against any number of pro-racist policies. Um, but it's interesting that it didn't seem to be that what happened in Duluth wasn't sponsored or stimulated by agitation from the Klan. So the Klan did exist in northern Minnesota in very, very small groups. We had activities of outstate Minnesotans who would use some of the vestments of the Klan in order to harass immigrants and unfavored immigrants in particular, namely the Germans. There was a lot of harassment there, but you didn't see the existence of the Klan much either in Minneapolis or in St. Paul or Duluth at that particular time.
Yes. We have another question from Beth Bailey. Community Mediation Minnesota has called for a truth and reconciliation kind of process in Minnesota. Does this ever come up in conversations around the lynching?
Michael?
Well, if it has, I am not aware of that.
I haven't heard anything.
I hadn't heard anything about that either. Well, one of the things I was going to bring up, and I know that you're aware of this, Bill, that I believe Minnesota, because of the lynching, was the first state to enact an anti-lynching law.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing to think that 100 years later, it still is not a national law. In fact, as recently as last week, it was held up in the Senate.
Yeah. It's also interesting to note that, well, there's so many things that are of interest around that law itself, which I can talk a little bit about later. But the key thing is that Minnesota wasn't the only state that had an anti-lynching law. Minnesota would enact one in 1921, and stunningly enough, it was enacted by almost a unanimous legislature. Only one legislator voted against it. I believe in the House it was unanimous, and in the Senate there was only one senator who voted against it. I believe that's how the numbers go. But Minnesota basically joined a community of other states that had anti-lynching laws, or some aspect of it. Minnesota's own law itself was modeled from Kentucky. Alabama had an anti-lynching. California, New York, and any number of other states had anti-lynching laws. And what's interesting about this, Kentucky was one of the states. The United States Senator from Kentucky today is one of the loudest voices against federal legislation to criminalize the act of lynching. That's a stunning thing. It shows that he hasn't been reading his own history or something else that's going on there.
We have another question here, Bill, from Evan Gilead. After the killing of George Floyd, do either of you think that the average white Minnesotan recognizes the racial tension within the state, or that this was an isolated death like before the Duluth lynchings?
I think that's a very interesting question, a very compelling question, and one that I cannot answer because, as I said before, as a historian, my inclination is to be skeptical. how earth-shattering, how much change there's going to be based upon what's happening right now. I do believe that until George Floyd's death, his killing, that there were a lot of Minnesotans who still did not have a sense of the problems of law enforcement with regard to African Americans. That the number of African American men who were killed were coincidental and not connected to each other in terms of the style of enforcement. that a lot of police departments felt that they could embrace. Um, so I think that for the most part, what has happened since George Floyd, what has happened since the people moving to the streets and going through their right of fire, so to speak, that sort of educated a lot of people. And not only that this is a problem that has occurred before, but that it's safe to really sort of look at it, to embrace it as a reality. That I'm not out there by myself. People become more enlightened when they see other people, oftentimes like themselves, who are validating what the individual seeing for the first time. So in a sense, the communities, the public, different ethnic groups are kind of saying, yes, this did happen. What are we going to do about it? We see a manifestation of that in what Congress is attempting to do with regard to push forward policy to mandate better police accountability. It's certainly appearing on all of the major newspapers and the
Yes.
major press. And it's becoming an issue that is international. I mean, Michael referred to one of the interviews he had with I don't know if he shared it during his broadcast, but we were interviewed by a reporter from Great Britain, Daily, I forget the name of the newspaper. It's a prominent newspaper.
It was the Daily Mirror.
Their Daily Mirror. I talked to a reporter from Finland who sent me a link of the article that she wrote, though it was in Finnish, so I couldn't read it. But um, this is a story that has been picked up all over the world,
Yes.
and I think to some extent, policymakers and also governmental officials feel a little awkward that the train has left the station without them.
Yes.
Some of them feel very, very awkward about these images depicting America in what they would consider to be a negative light to the world. This is not entirely unlike what happened in 1956, I believe, with the integration of Little Rock High School, where white kids were caught in the press attacking black children who just wanted an education. And also, there are images where white kids were being pushed around at the point of bayonets. These images were being broadcast all over the world at the time when the United States was viewed as a beacon of democracy and enlightenment, where much of the world under totalitarianism was fearful of democracy. We were somehow a shining beacon. And yet, looking at the unrest in America, we were showing that we haven't solved our problems. That was embarrassing for President Eisenhower. And
Yes.
I can imagine that what we're seeing today is embarrassing for this president. To put
Yes.
it lightly.
We have another question. I think this one is for you, Bill, from Timothy Sodden Groves, who says, Dr. Green, how do we begin to extend the discussion of and take action against systemic racism beyond the realm of police brutality and judicial inequities? How do we introduce this same conversation into our approach to reforming or rebuilding our understanding and expectation of education, economics, the environment, and healthcare? Well, that's a mouthful.
Well, thank you, Timothy, for offering that question. I don't recognize your name, but I'd like to say you're one of my students. Not to say that I'm the one who's bestowing wisdom, because one of the reasons why I feel hopeful is because the students I teach who taught me a lot about what's possible in society. I think that leadership, a strong leadership in the state especially, can set the tone for really defining what systemic racism means. I think our governor, for example, gave me reason to feel hope when he talked about how we will not really be able to deal with such things as police misconduct and violence in the communities against Black men until we look at such things as the achievement gap in education, and the employment gap, and the health gap, and the housing gap. All of these things are connected. And, that can only happen when the leadership embraces that approach, sees that as a priority, to how to make the kind of society we elected him to lead us to. Um, but I think the leadership has to be key. If we don't have leadership at the top, setting the tone, giving the license for us to think in those broader terms, and also helping to direct resources, then we can't really make those kinds of connections. And if we can't make those kinds of connections, we're going to see this same problem over and over and over. Different guises, different individuals, but the dynamic will be the same. So I'm hopeful that the policymakers are thinking about that.
We have a question from Derek Dixon. What did the police force look like in Duluth at the time of the lynching? How is it similar or different now? Well, it was, I'll tell you, it was a lot different then. And in fact, back in the day, in that era, if you wanted to apply for work as a police officer, the primary requisite was that you were big, so that you could handle rough stuff. You didn't have, there was no educational requirement. Just a big, tough-looking guy, strong man. You could get a job as a cop. A family friend who was a police officer, who came on the force sometime in the late 1930s, said that when he became an officer and he fit the physical qualifications, he was about 6'2" and 210 pounds, he said he got one instruction. And that instruction was his first day on the job. A senior officer said, if you're on the beat downtown Duluth and you see a drunk in the Bowery, give him a kick in the butt and tell him to go to his room. That was the extent of job training for a police officer in Duluth in the 1930s. There was nothing else there at all. And so you had a lot of officers who were of that ilk. Probably a number of them were not high school graduates. Now, of course, officers have to have at least a 2-year college degree before you can even apply for the job. Now, the makeup of the force was these folks from working class neighborhoods who became police officers. They didn't have much in the way of investigative skills, and they were, just their arrests were kind of rough, and they tended to look into the rough areas of town and work there, and it was just that kind of a job. It was not one about community relations. In fact, the chief of police in Duluth, John Murphy at the time, this was his first law enforcement job. He didn't come up through the ranks. I can't remember what he did, but he became chief of police. He was appointed chief of police by the Commissioner of Public Safety, who was in charge, happened to be in charge during the riots there in Duluth, and ordered the police not to use firearms. But neither one of those people had any prior law enforcement experience at all. And so that's what you were looking at now. Now, interestingly, the chief of police in Duluth is a man named Mike Tuscan, who is the grandnephew of Irene, who was the woman who alleged that she had been assaulted.
Wow.
And he is very involved in the Clayton Jackson McGee organization in Duluth, and is very supportive of that, and joined them for the opening of the Lynching Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. We have another question here. What are the mechanics of forgetting history like this, from Danielle Dart?
Well, the mechanics for forgetting history is not talking about it, not teaching it, not publishing books, not encouraging young people to read and think. not supporting the historical society, not supporting education, undercutting education funding, um, critical thinking, not teaching critical thinking. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we can do to undercut the potential of what we're talking about, critical thinking and reflective judgment, and accumulating information in the process of getting wisdom, figuring out the best ways to make decisions.
This this was purposeful in Duluth, though. Is by getting rid of all of the vestiges of that in repositories. So this was, I don't know if somebody one day said, don't talk about this anymore. I mean, it was just kind of systemic that people decided they won't talk about this anymore. We won't pass this on to our children. And
Michael, could you talk about, you shared this several times before, but I think it's so poignant and so relevant here. The friend visiting your stepmother's
yes,
home.
yeah. This would have been, I would say, maybe just a dozen years ago. That my stepmother, who lived on Park Point in Duluth, had a lifelong friend from the same neighborhood, and invited the lady over for coffee. And as the woman came into the room, she noticed a copy of my book on a table. And she picked it up and scanned it for a moment and was aghast. And she said, "My goodness, that's Tom." And Tom was deceased by now, but Tom was her husband for 52 years. She knew nothing about this, and there is a picture of Tom in the front row of that Lynch tableau. Never said anything to her, never said anything to their children. She was stunned by this discovery, learning that her husband had not only been there, but seemed to have been involved in it, because there he was in the front row of the photo.
Did she ever describe what it was that stunned her the most? That her husband was there, or the expression on his face? Yeah.
Well, I don't know that. My stepmother didn't go into that, but just said that it was very upsetting to this lady to learn that her husband not only was there, but there he was in the front row of the picture that was taken for the postcard. We have a question from Carlos Gonzalez Jr., who asks, what was the reaction of the faith community during the time of the Duluth lynching? I can answer that at least in part, perhaps not universally for whatever went on in many of the congregations in Duluth, but there were a couple of two priests from the Duluth diocese who were among the mob trying to get it to stop. One, Father William Powers, made impassioned pleas talking to young men that he knew from his parish, trying to get them to go home and not participate. He went as far as to climb up the pole when Isaac McGee was going to be hanged, and tried to stop it, and was pulled from the pole, and made some reference to this as this, in the name of God, stop this, or whatever it was he said. And the retort was, this has got nothing to do with God. And they proceeded with the hanging. The minister, the chief head pastor at the First Presbyterian Church in Duluth, gave a sermon about the lynchings, which was reprinted and widely distributed in Duluth. I can't imagine that any people in the faith community were supportive of the mob. I never heard of anything like that, although we did have two newspapers in Minnesota, the Ely Miner and the newspaper in Mankato, both editorialized in favor of what the mob did. And that was also shameful and a surprise to me to encounter. There's another question just coming in from Patty Sullivan asking me, where did you first come across the information about the lynchings in Duluth? When I was a boy, my mother brought it up, and I don't remember the context. I couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. She just said that this happened, and it happened about a mile from where we were living. I wish I could remember the context. I can't. She told me about it, and it must have just been in the back of my mind, and it resurfaced many years later when I was going to write this novel set in post-World War I northern Minnesota. I asked other people about it as well. I think when I was a kid, I said, "Did you ever hear of this?" I was asking adults in my family, and some of them would say something like, "No, I didn't know this," or, "I heard of it, but I didn't pay much attention," or something to that effect. So there was no real evidence. And my mother was only a little girl at the time, so she wouldn't have known anything more than the fact that it had happened. Another question here. Go ahead. Bill, were you going to say something?
No.
Okay, there's another question here from Jordan Stager. How do the words we use to describe these events, lynching, murder, assassination, killing, police officer, law enforcement, etc., impact collective memory of these events? What can we do today to ensure that the public consciousness memory of George Floyd is accurate and is not hidden like these lynchings were?
Let me take a stab at that. That's a complicated question. I'm glad you raised it. It's a complicated question. I think that the words that you listed, lynching, murder, assassination, are accurate terms to describe certain acts. But at the same time, they're so inflammatory that it allows people who really need to pay attention to escape, because I'm not responsible for it. It's almost like, I think, when in the 90s we were talking about this action is racist, or that individual is racist, or I'm not a racist. The term was laden with images of robes and burning crosses, and what that does is allow the person who was being challenged to grapple with their baser instincts to get off the hook, to assume no responsibility for what the term is intended to suggest. So I think that those words are not to be avoided, but they must come with discussion, dialogue. They must come with more words. And words shared that allow people to kind of become a part of understanding, of unfolding the dynamic that we need to fully understand. The thing about history is that it can often and easily be relegated to the past. That's the problem that I think some people have with history, unfortunately. Instead of trying to figure out how history is living, it is a part of today in a sense. How do we use our words to describe a complex issue, or an issue that is at least as complex as our present day existence, our lives today? I think we must always deal with the difficulty, the challenge, the labor, the effort to try to engage in discussion on these kinds of things. So.
And to use this in our educational systems, that these incidents need to be taught, brought up, and discussed, and otherwise it can slip away, just like the lynchings in Duluth did. Nobody talked about them in schools at all either, and just didn't happen. Here's a question from Gina Couillard. Can you tell us about the victims, family, occupation? Very little. What I know about those men who were killed is that none of them had much education. We do know that Max Mason, who was later convicted for raping Irene Tuscan, had never gone to school, or I guess he'd gone to school for 2 weeks. So he was completely illiterate. Probably the others may have been as well. What some historians have speculated is that these were mainly Southern black men who looked for a chance to get away from the South, get a chance to see the country. They could travel with a circus. And so it may have been an advantageous kind of position, a step up from where they had been. And otherwise, there was only one who seemed to have family, and that was Elmer Jackson, whose father came to Duluth, had his body exhumed for identification, and tried to bring a suit against the city of Duluth for wrongful death. It was thrown out immediately. It didn't progress at all. And interestingly, a young man from Washington, Warren Reed, learned that he, through a genealogy pursuit some years ago, learned that his great grandfather was Joseph Dondino, who was one of the ringleaders of the mob. And Warren has written a book himself called The Lyncher in Me, in which he talks about his family. He also has managed to find one of Elmer Jackson's cousins, who, until Warren talked to her, located her, she didn't know that her cousin was Elmer, who had been lynched. So it's kind of coming full circle. She has now been to the memorial site and to programs in Duluth on 2 or 3 occasions, and was slated to be back there again this year before the pandemic moved the commemoration activities till 2021. So we know very little. Here's a question from Jody James. Mr. Fedo, you wrote in 2018 that women hold keys to America's future. What was the role of women in the 1920 lynching? Well, it was Irene Tuscan who she didn't really make the report. The young man, James Sullivan, that she was with, made this report. He told his father. Irene went home and went to bed, said nothing to her parents. James Sullivan, the young man, told his father that Irene had been assaulted and that he had been held at bay at gunpoint, so he couldn't do anything to defend her honor, as it were. So that was the role of a woman then. I suppose people in the mob, and this was brought up by the mob as they were assembling and trying to get people to join the necktie party, was that what would you do if this had been your sister, your wife, your mother, your daughter? What would you do? And this certainly fanned the flames of people trying to get something to happen to the men who were in the Duluth jail at the time. I don't think, other than that women had any vocal role in this, except as the mob formed, there were many women there, and children were there as well. And one can assume that many of the women were encouraging the mob activists to get this act taken care of.
On the other side of that, we don't forget Nellie Francis, who
Yes.
led the effort to pass or to enact the anti-lynching law. She found the language and organized the lobbying effort in the legislature and African American women who made lynching a crime. It's stunning that it wasn't.
Indeed.
Murder was a crime, but not lynching.
Yes. I can't determine any of what that might have been, or what the attitudes and thoughts of the women. But we have time for one final question, and it looks like it is mostly for you, Bill. Dr. Green, can you talk about the significance of the lynching of Elias Clayton, Elmer Jackson, and Isaac McGee happening in the North? What was the racial climate like in America? A 2-point question there.
Wow. I think, simply put, the Duluth lynchings showed that Minnesota was not exceptional. because the incident itself was very much part and parcel of how race relations were dealt with in the North and throughout the country. Lynching was everywhere, and it was celebrated in the film Birth of a Nation in 1915. Um, it was pretty much sanctioned. It was permitted to be a way in which people who are dealing with all kinds of socioeconomic problems and whatnot could expel the frustration at the single charge of a white woman being raped by a black man. That suddenly we could solve all the problems we have, all the resentments we have in society by taking it out on an African American.
I
So
think,
I think that basically that's a recurrent thing that not only played up in in East St. Louis, um, but in the film Birth of the Nation, in Chicago, in Waco, Texas, in any number of other cities in the second decade of the 20th century. The usual grievance of a black man raping a white woman spurred him off the form.
yes.
And
Well,
that seems
I
a
think
thing on itself, really.
I think this brings us to the end of our discussion and conversation. We thank all of you who submitted questions and also those of you who are tuning in on this. And we're very delighted with how this has gone. I will close with a quote from Minneapolis Police Chief Arredondo, who called Mr. Floyd's death absolutely pivotal in the city's history, a springboard to change and begin healing. And let's hope for that. Thank you for tuning in.